Amos chapter 1, our Bible character study. It's number 18 tonight. I think the page number is 76 in the notebook. And we have a double-sided sheet, so we'll look at that. But I'm going to read a couple verses out of Amos chapter 1 while we begin. And I'm going to read through verse 12. Amos chapter 1, looking at verse 1. The words of Amos, who is among the sheepherders from Tekoa, which he envisioned in visions concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. He said, "The Lord roars from Zion, and from Jerusalem he utters his voice, and the shepherd's pasture grounds mourn, and the summit of Carmel dries up. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment, because they threshed Gilead with implements of sharp iron. So I will send fire upon the house of Hazael, and it will consume the citadels of Ben-Hadad. I will also break the gate bar of Damascus, and cut off the inhabitant from the valley of Aven, and from him who holds the scepter from Beth Eden. So the people of Aram will go exiled to Kir, says the Lord. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment, because they deported an entire population to deliver it up to Edom. So I will send fire upon the wall of Gaza, and it will consume her citadels. I will also cut off the inhabitant from Ashdod, and him who holds the scepter from Ashkelon. I will even unleash my power upon Ekron, and the remnant of the Philistines will perish, says the Lord God. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Tyre, and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment, because they delivered up an entire population to Edom, and did not remember the covenant of brotherhood. So I will send fire upon the wall of Tyre, and it will consume her citadels. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment, because he pursued his brother with a sword, while he stifled his compassion. His anger also tore continually, and he maintained his fury forever. So I will send fire upon Teman, and it will consume the citadels of Basra. And there's much more, but we'll pause there. So this is Amos, and the prophets were unique men of God whom God sent to Israel and Judah to warn them of his coming judgment. Sometimes we're shocked by the terrible things God commissioned them to say to his people. We should keep in our minds as we read their words and ponder their messages how much God despises sin and rebellion. Sin is to our holy Lord what a cancerous brain tumor is to a dedicated oncologist. God hates sin. Amos lived and preached in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, about 760 BC, but God sent from the southern kingdom, Judah, where he lived, Amos to preach to the northern kingdom of Israel. So, question number 1 from chapter 1, verse 1, where was Amos from? Tekoa, and it's not too far from Jerusalem. What was Amos's occupation? He was a sheep herder, so he was a common, ordinary working man. That doesn't mean that he was illiterate, but it does mean that he did not hold a court position or something highfalutin like that. Number 2, why would Amos say that the Lord roars from Zion? Why roaring? Anger, ferocity. God is a God, we're told in the book of Psalms, who has indignation every day, and he's angry at sin. So we are drawn to the picture of God as loving and compassionate, and he is that, but we must also remember that he's a holy God, a God who hates sin, and what we're going to see in Amos is God hates sin, and that's why this kind of language. What character and action of God is Amos depicting? Yeah. So, judge and executor of justice and judgment. And there's a lot of fire in Amos, you're right. Number 3, notice that chapters 1 and 2 contain a formulaic phrase at the beginning of each paragraph for 3 transgressions of and for 4. See how many paragraphs there are in these 2 chapters and what groups of people are being addressed. So how many are there? There's 8 of them. And did you pick up on some of the groups that are addressed? All right, we got a lot of them. Damascus and Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, Moab, Judah, and Israel. And it's kind of interesting. It seems to kind of spiral around. So, Amos is preaching his messages in Israel, the northern kingdom. And it might even be that as he's preaching the beginning of these messages, and he's saying, God is angry with Damascus. And the inhabitants of Israel are saying, yes, we don't like Damascus. And Amos says, God is angry with Gaza down in the Philistine territory. And the Israelites saying, yes, we don't like the Gazans. But as it goes on, it kind of gets closer and closer and closer, and then it's finally them. And Amos says, God has something to say to you. And it's a very hard, harsh, tough message to the northern kingdom. So number 4, for what sorts of sins are the Gentile nations condemned by God? Yeah, so deportations of entire populations, cruel warfare. There's warfare, and then there's harsh, hard, horrible, cruel activities. And these Gentile nations, these pagan nations around Israel are being condemned for deporting an entire population or destroying cities when they didn't need to. For what sorts of sins does God, through Amos, condemn the Jews, that is, the nations of Israel and Judah? Rejecting the law of the Lord, they have not kept his statutes, Amos says in chapter 2, verse 4. As well as there's another thread, another theme that runs through Amos, social injustice. So they've taken advantage of people who are poor. They are not treating their fellow citizens properly. And it's true that so many times when there's a breakdown in the relationship with obeying God, there's a concomitant, a corollary breakdown in relationship among people. And that's certainly true here in the book of Amos. Do the Jews have a special accountability to God in Amos 3:1 and 2? Yes, they do. Why? He picked them. They are the chosen people. By the way, would there be any sort of a New Testament application? He picked us. We're not Jews, we're Gentiles, but he chose us. We're the people of God in the church age. And so, yes, there is accountability. Because we have been called by God, we have a higher level of accountability than the world around us does. And so that's a very serious thing. Number 6, what message does Amos have for the people of Ashdod and Egypt in 3:9? And watch, and what are they going to watch? Yes. And the downfall specifically of Israel. Yes. So they're going to be watching. So the message is, you people of Ashdod, that's down in the Gaza Strip, that's Philistines, and Egypt, again, these are traditional enemies of Israel, and they're being told, assemble on the mountains and watch God judge Israel. And that's a harsh thing, because the Israelites say, well, we're God's people, we're supposed to be watching God judge the Gentiles. But because of their sin, because of their rejection of God, now it's going to be these other pagan countries watching the downfall of the northern kingdom. And by the way, that's not that far. If this is between 760 and 750 BC, does anybody remember a date for the Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom? 722, 721. So about 30 years later or so is when the northern kingdom is going to be annihilated, gone. And that's part of what's going on here. So number 7, how low have the Jews sunk in chapter 3, verse 10? They no longer know how to do right. They no longer have the capacity to know right from wrong and to do the right thing. They can't even do it anymore. That's how bad off they are. In question number 8, chapter 3, verses 11 and 12, what judgment is God sending on the kingdom of Israel? Israel's capital is Samaria. Yep, surrounded by enemies, and then your strength will be pulled down. And the picture that Amos uses, remember, he's a shepherd. The picture that he uses is like the shepherd hears a lamb bleeding, and then a roar, and he says, this is trouble. And he runs out, and he's able to rescue a bit of an ear and a piece of a leg. Yes. A couple of legs and a piece of an ear. And this is in question 9 too. Will God's punishment totally eradicate and erase the Jews of Israel? No. There's a little bit left, a remnant. And the image that Amos uses is, again, a piece of a lamb in the corner of a couch. So it's like you go to rescue, your house is afire, and you run in and you're going to get what you can, and the only thing you can get is a corner of a chair. That's all that's left. And this is a picture of destruction. This is a picture of God's judgment on his own people, on the Jews, on the northern kingdom. Question number 10, chapter 7 of Amos is interesting. God shows a series of prophetic visions to Amos, indicating his wrath for Israel's sins. What is his first vision? A locust swarm descending on the spring crop. And how does Amos respond to it? Lord, Israel can't survive this. This locust swarm is going to eat everything. It's going to destroy. People will starve. We can't handle it. And so what did God do because of Amos's reaction? Changed his mind. He said, okay. He backs off. Question number 11, what was the second vision in chapter 7, verse 4? A great fire. I've read books about the San Francisco fire. Was it 1914? 1904, I think maybe. The great earthquake and fire. I've read a little bit about the Chicago fire. unbelievable, just devastation. There's no way to escape it. There's a very famous forest fire that started by a steam locomotive in Wisconsin, Peshtigo, the great Peshtigo fire, and it burned an entire town. People were jumping into the river to try to survive. These things are horrible, awful. Rebecca told me yesterday, the haze in the air, you know what that is? It's from the fires in California and Washington, Idaho, Montana. It's the wildfires in the west that we've got this smoke over us right now. Unbelievable. So how did Amos react to this vision of a great fire that consumes Israel? We're so small. We can't handle this. If you send a great fire like that, we're done. We're eradicated. And what did God do? Changed his mind. He said, okay, I am merciful, I'm compassionate. Does this is not part of our question sheet, but does this sound like anything that you're thinking of? Abraham talking to the angel of the Lord about Sodom and Gomorrah. Lord, would you destroy the whole city if there were 50 righteous? How about 25? How about 10? Does it sound a little bit like Moses when Israel had sinned with the golden calf and God says, I'm done. This idolatry, this rebellion, this arrogance, I'm done. Moses, I'm going to make you the progenitor of a new nation. And Moses, what does Moses do? Gets on his knees and he says, oh God, please forgive them. Please forgive them. If you can't forgive them, then kill me. And he intercedes. And of course those others, Abraham and Moses, and there's more, but those would be little tiny shadow pictures of what? Jesus saying to the Father, take me and save them. Yeah. So Amos is pleading on behalf of Israel. And the third vision is of what? A plumb line. So what is a plumb line? Yeah, so it's usually coiled up in a reel. Right. And you fasten it up high, and then it hangs down. It's got a weight. And then it's going to show you exact vertical lines. So you let it hang, and it dangles, and it swings for a minute. But when it finally settles, that is exactly straight up and down. And it's used for determining precise vertical lines. And in this case, it's kind of like, okay, everything on the right hand gets saved, everything on the left hand, it's judged. It's an instrument of judgment. And so God is going to judge Israel. Question number 13. In chapters 7, 10 through 17, we have the historical record of some responses to Amos's preaching. You should keep in mind that the high priest, Amaziah is his name, mentioned here, is not one selected or approved by God. The northern kingdom's priests had apostatized from the truth. They were probably not even Levites. They were fully invested in propping up the sinful and rebellious kings who ruled in the north. What was the report that Amaziah sent to Jeroboam the king about Amos? Yeah, he says, Amos is conspiring against you. And that's not true at all. Amos is preaching against you, but there's no conspiracy. As is so often the case, when there's sin involved, the people who are being warned about it misunderstand and misinterpret, sometimes willfully. They don't want to be told what really is going on. And so the high priest says, Amos is conspiring. He's not conspiring. He's preaching God's doom. Number 14, what command did Amaziah give to Amos? Stop prophesying. Get out of Bethel. You have to stop. I guess today you might call that cancel culture. We're censoring you. You're not allowed to say that here. What was his reason for this command? Bethel is a royal residence. The king has a palace here. In other words, you're going to make the king uncomfortable. This isn't polite. Don't treat the king like this. Now, when you see what Amaziah, the false high priest, is saying, compared with what Amos is prophesying, do you see there's in literature you call it a juxtaposition. There's a very harsh contrast. Amaziah, the high priest, is saying, you're going to make the king uncomfortable. He won't be able to rest well tonight. He's upstairs eating Jell-O and whipped cream, and if he hears you, you're gonna upset his dinner. And what is Amos saying? God is sending fire to blow this place up because you people are sinners. And the high priest is saying, you can't talk like that here. You're going to upset the king. Do you see the contrast? And they're concerned with their own petty little power blocks rather than listening to the authority of God. Number 15, what do Amos's words in 7:14 and 15 mean? This is where he says, I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I'm a shepherd and a tender of sycamore trees and so on. Yeah. He's a regular guy. He's not a professional prophet. He says, I didn't go to school to be a prophet. My dad was not a prophet. I'm not doing this because I was trained this way. I'm doing it because God gave me a message. I'm here because God told me, go up north to Samaria and read them the riot act. Tell them the end is near. And so Amos says, you're not understanding. I am not a professional. I've not been hired to do this. I haven't been trained to do this. I'm here because God gave me a message and you had better listen to it. And so his authority comes from where? He's called by God. By the way, do you think that there is a thread of continuity between the Old Testament office of prophet and the New Testament office of pastor? Now, we'll be very, very careful to say, by that we don't mean that Nathan and I get visions from God and you know, our words are inspired. No, we don't mean that. But the authority and the message and the requirement. Amos is required to go tell people living in Samaria, you had better listen to God. And pastors are required by God to tell people, you'd better listen. And we have to do that whether we like it or not. There are times, and maybe you know this already, when a pastor might know something, and the message that he's got to preach, because it's right there in the Bible in front of him, he looks out and he says, uh-oh, what I have to say today is very likely going to offend so-and-so. They aren't going to like it. So do you fudge? Do you kind of skip that point? You kind of, you know, you're talking along in a normal tone of voice, and then you can't. You can't. The prophet can't, and the preacher in the New Testament can't either. And that's what Amos is saying. I'm not a prophet. I'm not the son of a prophet. I'm a shepherd. I pick sycamore fruit. That's what I do for a living. I'm here because God said, go to Samaria and tell them the judgment of God is upon you. And if you don't get right, you're gone. And so that's why he's there. What does Amos's response to Amaziah indicate about the timing of the coming of God and God's judgment? Exactly. He's not going to stop talking. He says, you can't shut me down. You can try to, but you can't. And he says, the judgment of God is real soon. It's around the corner. Number 16, from chapter 9, will people in Israel be able to run and hide from God's punishment? No, no, it never works. And those of us who have walked with the Lord for a few years, probably each one of us can give some stories about that, about trying to sweep something under the carpet, or trying to hide from God, or we know that God is trying to discipline us, but we're running as fast as we can away from it. It never works. It is always so much better to turn around and face the Lord and say, Lord, whatever you've got to say to me, whatever you need to do to get my heart straightened out, you go ahead and do it. So you can't hide from God's punishment. Number 17, as is typical of most prophetic ministries, the final verses of chapter 9 are very different from most of the book. How are 9, 11, and 15 different? Yes. Great hope and restoration. Looking ahead to God's promises, even after all the gloom and doom of nearly 9 chapters of judgment and fire and locust, and listen to God's punishment, and it's pretty hard stuff. But as is usually true with the prophets, there is a little sliver in which God says, by the way, you're still my people, and I still love you, and I still have big plans for you. And the very last couple of verses are restoration and hope. If God's promises for the rest of the book come to pass, will his promises in this passage come true? Absolutely. They haven't yet, but they will in the millennial kingdom. What is the picture in verse 13, and what does it mean? Yes, yes. So everything is just fertile. The ground is fertile. Things are growing and growing and flourishing, and he can't keep up with it. It's like the Garden of Eden, and that's really kind of what this is. It's the millennial kingdom. This is what it's going to be like when Israel is here in the restored position that she should be in, with Jesus Christ as king, sitting on the throne and ruling, and Israel will be the hub of the world. And the ground will be blessed, and plant life is going to grow, and it's going to be amazing. So even Amos, with all the fire and doom, has a message of hope and restoration at the very end for God's people. Comments or questions on Amos? So the destruction of the northern kingdom is, I'm trying to remember Amos's dates. He started ministering somewhere around 760. The bulk of his ministry is probably about the next 10 years, 750. But he probably did preach up until 745 or in that vicinity. You can get at that by judging the names of the kings that are mentioned in chapter 1. And so from 745 to 722 is about 23 years. So it's not too long. It's within a lifetime. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Take your prayer bulletins, please, and let me share with you.